Hello, welcome to this revision video from the St Peter's English department. This one's going to be about Scrooge from A Christmas Carol. So just to quickly outline how this is going to run, I will be giving a very brief overview of the plot just so that you can see where Scrooge actually fits into the bigger picture. I'll be talking through some key elements of context that is relevant when we're discussing Scrooge, and also I'm then going to identify key moments within the novel as a whole where there are key parts to do with Scrooge. So for the plot then, this is a very scaled down version of the overall plot. You must make sure that you are not just relying on something as straightforward as this to make sure you know the plot. Please make sure you do read the text as many times as possible. But in a nutshell, as you can see from the bottom, it's a story that goes from a character being bad to learning some lessons, ending up a good guy. So to break that down into the staves then, stave 1, it opens with Scrooge receiving a warning. So we have Scrooge at work with his clerk. We see his sort of cold nature straight away. And then towards the end of that stave, he is then visited by Marley's ghost, and it's at that point that he receives a warning about potentially ending up the same way he has if he doesn't change his ways. Stave 2 then is where we get the first of the ghosts who come to visit. So the first one is the ghost of Christmas past, and this is where the ghost then takes Scrooge back through his lifetime, and we start to see kind of like the backstory to Scrooge and the events that have led him to be the way that he is in the present. So for example, we'll see him going back to when he was at school, and we also see him with his previous employers, and we also see him with his ex-fiancée. Then stave 3, so Scrooge learns about the joy of Christmas. So we have the ghost of Christmas present this time. And Scrooge is taken to the Cratchit's family, and they are celebrating Christmas, and yeah, at that point he then moves along to stave 4 now, and it's the ghost of Christmases yet to come, and this one shows Scrooge his future. And this one in particular has a very poignant moment where Scrooge is taken to a graveyard and he sees his own name on a grave that is isolated, abandoned, neglected, stressing to Scrooge that he will basically die a very lonely old man if he doesn't change his ways. And then finally, stave 5, Scrooge is a changed man. So he finds himself back in bed. It's Christmas Day. He's woken up with a fresh look on things following the visitation of the ghosts, and he then decides to go and spend Christmas with his nephew. He sends gifts to the Cratchit family, and he has a whole new outlook on life at this point. So just to outline a few of the key ideas with context, we need to understand what type of story this is. And this is what we would call an allegory. So from the definition, you can see that an allegory is a story, a poem, or a picture that can be interpreted to reveal a hidden meaning, typically a moral or a political one. So this one has a significant moral message to it. The intention is that we learn a lesson from this story. And then the other bullet point there says a symbol. Now that's relevant here because characters and events in the novel are all symbolic. They are all symbols that allow us to unpick a deeper meaning in this text. So Scrooge, for example, represents all of the values that are opposed to the idea of Christmas. So for example, he represents greed, selfishness, lack of goodwill, lack of charity, for example. And then this reaches beyond the aims of simply retelling a Christmas tale. So on the surface level, this is just a nice story of around Christmas time. However, underneath that, there is a much more significant message being delivered by Dickens. So, social criticism. This text, as I've said, has a moral message, but it's also a critique of Victorian society at the time. So my first point here then is that Dickens understood poverty. He knew it very well, it was very close to home, and poverty is a theme that runs throughout a lot of his texts, as it's something that he really felt he had to challenge with society at the time. So in 1824, his father was arrested for debt. So he struggled with poverty growing up, and he ended up having to give up his education, and he had to then work in a factory as a child to work towards paying off his father's debts. Now this text is also a criticism of the poor laws. So at the time, the local parishes were responsible for basically giving alms and charity and looking after the poor people. But people who had a bit more money didn't like this. They thought that the poor laws were too charitable. And an example of someone who believed that was the economist Thomas Malthus. He thought the poor laws were far too charitable, and he believed that poverty was just inevitable. It was just a fact of life that there were always going to be poor people. He also had a very negative view of the poor. There was definitely a sense of real misunderstanding. It was a commonly held belief that if you were poor, it's because you didn't work, you were lazy, and therefore you deserved to live in that poverty. So in 1834, in response to this sort of idea that maybe the poor laws were too generous, which of course they weren't, but in response to this in 1834, there was a new poor law given, and that was to reduce the financial help for the poor. Now, instead of parishes supporting their local communities, for financial help, people would have to go and work in a Victorian workhouse, and that is where they would receive their food and shelter. Now, you probably know already, but these were places that were notoriously bad in terms of working and living conditions. So this was not a nice option, and it definitely caused a lot of people to suffer. So number 3 then, in stage 1, Scrooge tells the charity collectors that it would be better if the poor died, as it would decrease the surplus population. So I've included this reference here just because it almost epitomises the viewpoint of people like Thomas Malthus, who believed that the poor were just an obstacle, they were just a hurdle, they sort of ruined it for everybody because it meant everyone else had to look after them. And it's a very cold approach, very unfeeling and unsympathetic, and very unchristian. So number 4 then, Dickens criticises these views. So we see this mainly through the very highly sympathetic way in which Dickens presents the poor people. So the Cratchit family in particular are always very generous and loving, and they're presented to the reader in a way that makes us see them as wholly good people. And so by doing that, he criticises the very cold view that these people deserve the poverty that they're living in. And then finally, I've just written here that this text, A Christmas Carol, could be considered a didactic text. So didactic meaning intended to teach us something. So that term lines up quite nicely with this being an allegory where there is a moral lesson. And it could also be considered a political diatribe offering moral warning for the consequences of greed. So political diatribe, a diatribe just means a forceful and bitter attack. So through the vehicle of the novel, Dickens is clearly attacking society at the time. Right, so we need to now think about Scrooge's purpose. What is the reason for Scrooge existing in this text? So assessment objective 2 is completely focused around identification of writers' methods and understanding the impact that that has. So we need to consider Scrooge as a method. So Dickens uses Scrooge as a conduit to deliver his criticisms of society and teach his readers of the need for change. So a conduit is almost like a way of delivering something. He uses Scrooge to pass on this message to his readers. And then finally, we need to make sure we discuss Scrooge as a crafted character. So he has had to be very carefully composed to make sure that this message, this moral lesson, is as hard-hitting as it could be. So we aren't meant to like Scrooge at the very beginning. That is very clear due to the language choices that Dickens uses. However, the story and the message of this novel wouldn't be the same if we didn't have a sense of hope and we didn't see the potential for Scrooge to change. Now, we're not going to like him straight away, but as the novel moves through, there needs to be, we need to warm to him. Because if we don't, the reader doesn't care about what happens at the end. And we need to care to make sure that we really learn that lesson that Dickens is trying to teach us. So, you'll see in the later slides that I go through that some of the language is very clear in outlining the negative aspects of Scrooge, but there are also hints that there are positive qualities that could be unravelled later in the text. So we'll start by looking at Scrooge then in stave 1, right at the opening of the text. So at this point, this is when he really is described as a really hard character. So he's highly unsympathetic. He's cold and solitary in nature. So by solitary in nature, we just mean that he likes to spend his time alone. He doesn't have people around him. He's selfish. He doesn't care for anyone but himself. So in that first quotation, he's described as being hard and sharp as flint. So the adjectives hard and sharp in particular demonstrate that lack of compassion, the lack of empathy, and the hard in particular suggests that he's really hardened to the world. There's nothing gentle or soft about him. And then flint is an interesting noun to use here, because flint is actually used to make fire. And so as much as it's a real solid material that also works to describe Scrooge as a very negative and hard character, the potential to create fire is possibly a suggestion that there's the potential for some warmth in there as well. So again, that's really unpicking layers of meaning there, but maybe something that we shouldn't ignore. Maybe at this point it is Dickens hinting to the reader that there might be the potential for some change in Scrooge. So the next quotation is an excellent example of Dickens using repetition to get his point across. So we can see when he says his sole administrator, his sole assign, his sole residuary legatee, his sole friend and sole mourner. So at this point, he's describing Scrooge in relation to Marley. So Marley's just died, and he's describing the fact that Scrooge was the only person who was there for Marley. Now Marley is a character very much like Scrooge. They are so similar, in fact, that the text actually tells us that they're almost interchangeable. People call Scrooge Marley and Marley Scrooge, and they both just answer to the same name. Now, Marley's ghost appears later and warns Scrooge that he is in danger of living a life just like him, and you know, in the afterlife, sort of carrying the burden of the poor choices he made. And that repetition of soul is highlighting that real solitary nature, the fact that he is selfish, he only worries about himself. But it's also highlighting the fact that there is no one else around for Marley, and the fact that Scrooge was his only friend and therefore he had only him to mourn his death. We get the warning from Marley that this is possibly what will happen to Scrooge, and we can maybe wonder at this point, would he even have anyone to mourn him now, because the only person he really had, who was Marley, has already passed. And then finally, there's an interesting simile to describe him. He's described as being solitary as an oyster. It is an interesting choice of language, but if we unpick it slightly, we could probably pick out a few interesting thoughts about that. So an oyster, we could consider to be sort of a tough, closed exterior, that shell. But then inside an oyster is where pearls are formed. Now again, a bit like the flint, if we were to sort of dig into that a little bit, could this potentially be Charles Dickens suggesting that inside Scrooge there is the potential for something good? There is something within him that is worth trying to get out. Again, something just to think about. So then we move on to Scrooge's past in stave 2, and we learn how Scrooge's past has shaped him. We get an impression here that there are events that have happened to him that evoke a sense of sympathy. So this is what I mean when we say that Scrooge can't be completely unlikable the entire way through. There has to be some element to Scrooge that makes us want to sympathise and almost hope that he will change. And we start to see that in this chapter. So first of all, he is taken back to his childhood, and he sees himself at school at Christmas time where his family have not come to collect him. So a couple of the quotations here are really focusing again on how lonely he is. So the quotations, solitary child, lonely boy, the adjectives solitary and lonely there reinforce the fact that he is very much alone and almost neglected in that way by his family. And he sees himself in a long, bare and melancholy room. So Dickens is creating that really dismal and negative atmosphere to heighten that sense of sympathy from the reader. And then when when Scrooge looks and sees himself as a child, he wept to see his poor forgotten self. So it breaks his heart to see what happened to him as a child. And at the same time as Scrooge, the reader kind of starts to understand and connect dots a little bit as to why he is the way he is now. And then after that, he then sees his relationship with Belle break down, and he is reminded of the reason that broke down. So Belle says, "Another idol has replaced me." So naturally, she wanted to be the most important thing in Scrooge's life. And it's clear that Scrooge's desire for money is what eventually took over. And his interest in money took over his interest in his fiancée. And so she obviously decided then that she was going to leave him. And when he discusses this with the ghost following seeing this, he talks in a broken voice. Now that broken voice is what already suggests that he is being touched by what's happened. Now the fact that he's been emotionally moved by this so quickly in the novel is also another way that Dickens ensures we can see that there is the possibility for redemption and for change here. So later in the novel, Scrooge gets the opportunity to see himself as others see him. Well, no, I'll rephrase that. He has the chance to see how others see him. Okay, so things that they might not say to his face, he gets to hear and see himself without them being aware. So Mrs. Cratchit, it is very clear that she despises Scrooge because of how poorly he treated her husband, who works for him. And she calls him an odious, stingy, hard, unfeeling man. So we've got a list there of really quite powerful adjectives to highlight that hatred she has towards him. So odious meaning hateful, stingy is referring more to how he is with money, so quite miserly and tight with his money, hard and unfeeling. So we already have seen these kind of descriptions from the very beginning of the text, but it's interesting to see then how the characters that we are drawn to in terms of the good characters, how they interpret Scrooge themselves. They see him as really unkind and lacking in compassion, especially when her husband Bob Cratchit works so incredibly hard for him. So it creates that sense of sympathy for the Cratchit family. Now Fred is Scrooge's nephew, and he says something interesting. He says he's a comical old fellow and not so pleasant as he might be. Now it's clear that he does understand that his uncle is not a nice person. But this is another example of Dickens being, Dickens ensuring that we are seeing the poor people in a positive way. So he makes Fred look like a really good character, as he is still coming across relatively polite in what he's saying. He's saying negative things about him, but not doing it in such a harsh way as maybe Mrs. Cratchit is. He's being still quite amicable, pleasant in the way that he does it. Again, so we are then drawn to the natural goodness of Fred. So a businessman calls him an old scratch. Now, old scratch is a nickname for the devil. So obviously, putting that into context, we are talking about a text written and published in the Victorian era where religion was sort of widely practiced at the time. So reference to the devil would obviously have carried a lot of weight at that time. And then a couple who owe him money call him merciless. So when people are desperately in need, he does not show them any mercy at all. So he's very uncaring. The Cratchit family in general have a real impact on Scrooge and are largely responsible for the sort of changes that come around for Scrooge. But one character in particular really moves him, and that's Tiny Tim. So seeing Tiny Tim helps Scrooge feel empathy again. So when he talks to the ghost about Tiny Tim, asking if he's going to survive, he asks with an interest he has never felt before. So at this point, we are seeing that Scrooge is actually showing care and interest in someone other than himself. So his selfishness is reducing, and he is actually showing that he's got feelings and is interested in the well-being of other people. So that's sort of one step that enables him to change as well. He learns to be charitable. So he buys a turkey for the Cratchits on Christmas Day in the final stave and makes a large donation to charity. But it's when he talks about the turkey that's quite interesting. So he sends someone to go and deliver the turkey, and he says he shan't know who sends it. It's twice the size of Tiny Tim. So firstly, we've got obviously the focus on how big this turkey is. So we've got an idea of his generosity here. But for me, what is important here is the fact that he wants to stress that he shouldn't know who sends it. So he is trying to do good for the sake of doing good. He's not doing good here just because he wants people to see him doing good, because still that's to selfish ends. He wants to help this family without anything in return. So that shows a substantial change in him. And then finally, he learns the value of family and companionship. So we've had lots of references that describe him as being solitary and lonely, and being the selfish man he is at the beginning of the novel, he doesn't care for friends or family. But at the end of the text, he embraces his nephew's family at Christmas, and he goes to spend Christmas with them. And he describes that it was a wonderful party, wonderful games, wonderful unanimity, and wonderful happiness. So again, a bit like Soul Mourner, Soul Companion, we've got the same technique of repetition being used to demonstrate that change. So rather than being offended at the idea of being around other people at Christmas time, like he is at the beginning when Fred invites him to dinner, he is now joyous. And we can see that through the repetition of the adjective wonderful. And Dickens goes even that one step further for emphasis, and in that final wonderful, he breaks it down into its syllables and he hyphenates them to sort of stand them out individually. So here we see a huge change in his attitude. His attitude towards other people and wanting to spend time with them has significantly evolved up until now. And the very final thing I wanted to discuss here was the change in his values. So Dickens uses similes in this text quite a lot. So obviously the one we had before, he was solitary as an oyster. But we have a real contrast now, because he jumps out of bed in the morning and he says, I am as light as a feather, happy as an angel, giddy as a drunk man. He has sort of this list of similes, but they're all positive this time, and they all create a sense of joy and happiness to be alive, and a real sort of seize the day kind of attitude. And Scrooge becomes happy. So in stave 5, he says, Scrooge regarded everyone with a delighted smile. Now, the fact that he regarded anyone at all would be a positive development upon how he was. But now he regards everybody, and it's with a delighted smile, which suggests there is no effort. He is just very genuinely happy to see people. He's become generous. So at the beginning of the text, Scrooge is really reluctant to even give Bob Cratchit off any time over Christmas to be with his family. But by the end of the text, he is keen to say, I'll raise your salary. So he gets rid of that miserly attitude and starts realising that actually having money cannot replace having friends and having family. And then finally he becomes sociable. He actually wants to spend his time with people. So he kept shunning the invite from his nephew prior to this change. And then in the end, he's really keen to actually spend his time with his family. So he goes to Fred's house and he says, it's I, your Uncle Scrooge. I have come for dinner. Will you let me in, Fred? So the fact that he's voluntarily arrived at his nephew's house shows a real change in Scrooge, and a desire to now spend time with loved ones and seeing the value in the loving relationships he can have with family. Then the very final thing I wanted to just draw your attention to is we've already talked about Scrooge as a device in himself, a character that Dickens has constructed. So that in itself is a method, but you then need to be able to talk about that in light of structure. So you need to show that you understand that the character of Scrooge changes throughout the course of the novel. And that change comes about through the development of character. So the message of the text cannot be delivered unless Scrooge is slowly developing and evolving. So you've just got to make sure that you can communicate the fact that Scrooge as a character is a construction, is a method, a way of delivering a message, and it's the journey that that character is taken on that enables that message to come through in the end of the text. So that's just a very quick rundown of key things to do with Scrooge. If you have any questions or want to talk further about Scrooge, please know you can always get in touch with anyone in the English department and we will be more than happy to help you. Good luck with your revision.